So, Mike, we're here today to talk about last week's message in light of giving people an opportunity to ask some questions about final judgment. That was what we spoke on last week. So, just before we dive into asking some questions and answering some questions, can you just give us a bit of a recap about last week's message?
Sure can. So thanks everyone for your questions that came in during the week. We've got some really important and interesting topics to talk about today, but we do need to just quickly recap on the foundational principles that we discussed last week in order to have that foundation to build on. So let me just recap for you quickly the 6 points that we talked about last week. First principle is that judgment separates good from evil and right from wrong. Number 2, God is the perfect judge and we're not. The third principle, God can handle our questions and our complaints. Number 4, God's justice is always paired with his mercy. Number 5, God made justice and mercy perfect in Jesus. And number 6, God's final judgment will perfectly and permanently separate good from evil. As we answer some questions today, those 6 principles will really lay that foundation for us, and we'll refer back to them as we go through the questions that you've sent in.
All right, Mike. Well, I don't think there's going to be any simple question to dive in with. I don't think there's going to be any way to ease in. So let's get straight into it. First question, and I guess we'll try and mould a few together where we can, for the sake of ease of answering questions. The first one is just around this idea of it's a hard thing to comprehend, and it doesn't seem super fair that some people go to one place and some people go to another place forever. I guess the first question is that fair, and is it forever?
All right, well, let me take the last part of that question first. The idea of is hell forever? I think most people would agree that when the Bible speaks about heaven, that it clearly is forever. But you're right, it does feel to us like a punishment that doesn't have an end is disproportionate. It's bigger than the crime. Whatever the crime might have been, it was done in time, and usually a punishment would be for a fixed time. A punishment that doesn't end doesn't actually seem very fair to us. So we have to wrestle with that, and that's where keeping the 6 principles that we talked about in mind is really important. God can handle our questions and complaints, so we're going to really wrestle with that sense of, is this really fair? But God is the perfect judge, and he will always do what is perfectly right in every situation. So is it really forever? People throughout the centuries have had an idea of perhaps punishment is immediate and then it stops because those who go to hell are actually destroyed by hell and their consciousness ceases. Another popular idea is the idea of purgatory, where a punishment goes for a particular period of time in order to purify a person, and then they are able to make their way into heaven from there. So both of those ideas have been popular. In the time of Jesus, both of those ideas were held by rabbis, religious teachers of Jesus' day. So the people who were listening to Jesus would have been familiar with those ideas, and there wasn't much agreement. Some people thought of the place of punishment as a temporary thing that was something that purified a person, and they felt in many popular, I guess, musings on the subject that was a maximum of 1 year that punishment would go for. But there were other rabbis who taught that the punishment was an immediate destruction, and then others who taught that it went on forever and ever and ever. So different people have responded to that in different ways. So when we get to Matthew 25 and verse 46, Jesus has just been talking about the fact that he will separate the righteous from the unrighteous on the day of judgment. And he says, they will go away, speaking of the unrighteous, to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. And whenever Jesus speaks about judgment, he tends to speak about the fate of the wicked and the fate of the righteous in very similar terms. So it would be inconsistent if we applied eternity to one group and a temporary condition to another. So we see that in Revelation chapter 20 and numerous other places. So just for consistency's sake alone, and the fact that the Bible never explicitly talks about any period of purification, which is a doctrine that's found outside of Scriptures but never inside of Scripture, we would say that the Scripture itself would indicate that hell is forever. But is that fair, was the question you were asking.
Yeah, well, that was the two sort of locked in together. Is it fair that hell is a place, and is it forever, or is there a time that it ends?
Well, and I guess that links to the next aspect of what hell might actually be like. If we can agree that when the scriptures speak about hell, it speaks about it as an unending place of punishment, is that punishment just a one-size-fits-all kind of scenario, or are there degrees of punishment in hell? We might think through history of people who have committed certain types of crimes against humanity and of a huge scale, and there's something within us that says surely that sort of thing must be punished more than somebody whose crimes are far less. So if we, with our imperfect sense of justice, have a sense that justice should fit the particular crimes, well then surely God, who is perfect in justice, has a mechanism for that as well. And as we look in, again, staying in the Gospel of Matthew, if we flick back to chapter 11 of Matthew's Gospel, we do get a sense of that from a conversation that Jesus has there. So Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11, and he's speaking about the cities of Bethsaida and Chorazin, where he'd done a lot of ministry, but they hadn't responded in faith. And he says to them in verse 22, I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be lifted up to the skies? No, you will go down to the depths. If the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Sodom, it would have remained to this day. But I tell you that it will be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. In this and in Romans 2 and some other places, there are some indications that the way people are judged on the day of judgment will depend on the opportunities that they had to see and receive the truth, as well as their particular conduct. And again, God is the only one who can tell that perfectly. One example of that would be, I think most of us would agree that the sin of abusing a child sexually is a horrendous sin and it should be punished. Recently our Prime Minister has made statements concerning mandatory prison for convicted sex offenders. And so we would look at a sin like that and impose a fairly harsh punishment because the crime is terrible and it deserves a harsh penalty. I've often recounted, though, the experience that I had when I was doing youth work in a country town in Western Australia. And one of the guys I was working with, I later found out, had committed this crime, and I was outraged. But I also knew that he is somebody who had suffered from that kind of abuse as a child himself. So I don't want to write him off as a grub or as a lesser human being. I want to acknowledge that he had a terribly difficult life and an upbringing that marred him. And when it comes to the right judgment for his crime, I'm glad that that's not my responsibility, because he is both the damaged and hurting individual and an individual that damages and hurts others. I don't have the capacity to say what is the fitting penalty for any life. I'm so limited in my understanding of what has actually shaped people. What have been their real opportunities? Who's to say that if I had been raised in the way that he had, that I would not have committed similar atrocities? Those sort of complexities are just beyond the ability of any human being to perfectly judge. And that's why that principle that we spoke about last week, God is the perfect judge. He will do what is right and fitting in every situation. That's something that's really important for us to hold on to. So yes, it would seem that hell is forever. Yes, it would seem that punishment is proportional to your particular crimes against God and against others. And yes, I'm so glad that it's God who will make those decisions and not me.
So it won't be like a Dante's Inferno sort of like 7 levels or anything like that, will it? Because I guess for me, I think it's such a crazy thing to try and comprehend, isn't it? I guess when we start thinking about this stuff too much, I guess this is a roundabout way of kind of me asking, is it worth dwelling on this stuff too much? Like these things like, are there levels? That stuff doesn't change the fact that we need to go and share and declare the love of God to people to make sure that they understand the true message of Jesus and are joining us in eternity. But is it still important to dwell on the opposite, or is it should we almost not talk about the opposite and instead just talk about the positive?
Yeah, and I think that's where understanding the way the Bible depicts hell, the sort of metaphorical language that's being used. For example, there is fire and darkness and a worm that doesn't die. And when you understand the historical context, you realise the very real images that Jesus is drawing upon. Again, in terms of first century Jerusalem, the idea of the valley of Hinnom, which is Gehenna, where we get the word hell from. The idea that was a place where children in past years had been sacrificed to pagan gods in a fire. It was a terrible place, a place that people didn't want to go to. a place that God announced would be a place of judgment in the way he dealt with the nation of Israel. So even the very word hell and the imagery that it brought up for people was meant to simply emphasize the fact that it is a terrible place, a repulsive place, a place that you don't want to go. Not for people to get kind of all imaginary about, what exactly might go on in that place of final punishment. And certainly through medieval years, you've had plenty of paintings and plenty of stories written about what hell might be like. They have no foundation in biblical truth. They are the imaginations of people who are rightly trying to impress upon people, this is a place you don't want to go, but we need to be careful not to give too much authority to those kind of imaginings. And one thing that they often get wrong is the idea that in hell you are tormented by devils, by demons, by Satan and his followers. We know of hell as being the place where Satan and his angels are punished, not the place that they inflict punishment upon others. God doesn't want anyone to perish. God doesn't want anyone to share their prison. That's why Jesus came. But that hell is not their domain, it is their penalty. So that's one common misunderstanding that I think we need to be really clear about.
Following on from that about what you said about the demons tormenting us, the other question that was asked a bit that came through, and certainly something that comes through in pop culture, is that idea of, I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints sort of thing. So there's this imagery of, in hell at least you'll be with people, at least you'll be with your friends who might be there as well, and all of that kind of stuff.
I think that idea of I'd rather party in hell than, be all somber with the saints in heaven is kind of a common misconception that we have because we are drawn to do things that we shouldn't. We think that they're great and that they'll be the source of life for us. The Bible holds out the fact that life is actually found in God and in all the good things that he provides. So even if you think about when you're having a party with your mates, what are the things that you're actually enjoying there? Things like friendship and loyalty and humour and fun and the gift of creativity, if it's in the music you're enjoying, whatever it might be, they're actually tastes of goodness that get better in heaven. What happens when all of the good things that we enjoy in this world aren't with us anymore? Those experiences aren't going to be fun anymore. What if all you're left with when you gather with your mates is greed and jealousy and lust and the abuse of power and all of those sort of things that mess up our life? That's what hell will be full of. So the idea of partying with my friends in hell, you won't feel like partying. And that again is the imagery that Jesus gives, the weeping and the gnashing of teeth where people realise, I've made a terrible choice. That's why we don't want anyone to choose that.
So to round off these questions, the last question, which is a really, I guess, a tough and big one to answer because it's the practical level one. It's the one where for us we actually have to do something with. How do we even talk about this stuff? Because, it's just such a big thing and a tough thing, and it can feel like something that we're forcing our friends into, that whole idea of, well, if you don't want to go here, then choose this one. But that's not life-changing, and that's not presenting the gospel, and that's not presenting a loving and merciful and graceful God. That's just presenting something terrifying and saying, well, if you don't want to go there, do this. And we know that we've seen history, and fear might have worked once, but it's not life-giving, and it's not what we want to be presenting as the message of hope and love to our communities.
So it's important to recognise that we are coming from a really different starting point to the starting point that Jesus started from when he was talking about final judgment. See, the people he was talking to already had an awareness that there is a God in heaven who has the right to judge, a God who created the world good before evil was even a part of it, a God whose judgments could be trusted. And so when he speaks about judgment, there's already, I guess, a common understanding that people have that yes, God has a right to judge and he will do what is right. People today don't have that same foundation. There's either an open question of, well, we don't really know if there's a God or not, or an entrenched belief that there is no such a thing as God. God's just a construct used by religions to control the behaviour of other people. In fact, popularly, it's thought that heaven and hell are concepts that have been used through history to control people's behaviour, to make sure they don't do what they really want to do, what they need to do in order to be true to themselves. It's to keep them doing what the powers that be think they ought to do. And so when you start talking about heaven and hell now, people immediately leap to, you're just trying to control me. You're trying to stop me from acting out my desires and allowing me to flourish and be who I need to be in order to be true to myself. And that's the greatest, responsibility of every human being in the way that we think in our culture now. It's not to adhere to any authority's idea of what is right and wrong. It's not to do what any God might tell you is good versus evil. It's actually to be true to your own idea of what is good. And as long as you're doing that, you're doing right. We can trace that thinking right back to creation and the fall, where Adam and Eve wanted to be able to choose for themselves what they thought good and evil would be. They didn't trust God's judgment, and that's been the story of humanity ever since. If anything, grappling with the concept of heaven and hell isn't necessarily so that we can talk about heaven and hell with others, because in our culture, you're immediately got fists up when you do that. But what it does do is it gives us this sense of urgency within ourselves that these are important conversations to have. So as we think about the last principle that we talked about last week, which is God's final judgment, is the perfect and permanent separation of good from evil. The difference between life with God and life without God is just going to be incredibly stark, and it will be the final state for all people. You will either be with God or without him. But right now, we get to make the invitation, do you want to live in the here and now with God or without him? And we get to show people the beauty of what life with God can be like, and we get to expose the futility of what life without God can be like. Even though we're tempted to go our own way, the results of that aren't great. And if we can communicate that in the here and now, then we're preparing people to be on the right side of that into eternity. And I think that's something valuable that we can offer.
All right, Mike, well, we'll cut it there for now. You and I will continue to talk about this stuff, as I'm sure people now, as we finish the service, will want to keep talking about it. So, as you go out this week, how can you be sharing and declaring the love of God to your friends, to your family? Because this is just one of the many really big topics that you'll find yourself having to talk about. But how can we make sure that we can be showing people that life without God cannot compare to life with God? And really, you don't even have to talk about heaven and hell. When we can get people to understand that life with God is the ultimate joy, the ultimate prize, well, that's the only conversation we need to be having. So I hope that goes well for you this week.